Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dreaming Forward podcast. This month, we're going to be spending time talking about ESG, which is a hot topic on everyone's mind. I know that it can be a little bit confusing, and so we're going to spend time breaking down what is ESG at a high level, but then we're also going to spend time talking through each component of ESG. Before we get started, I want to make sure to wish everyone a happy holiday season. At the time that I'm filming this, it is the kickoff of the holiday season. And so I know that there are a number of holidays which people will be celebrating over the next 30 to 60 days. And so I just want to wish a joyous and prosperous holiday season to all of you. And of course, leading into the new year as well. I wish everyone the absolute best as you close out 2022. So let's get started with the topic for today. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it is an acronym that represents a three-pronged strategy designed to drive sustainability. So, sustainability at a high level is the concept that businesses or enterprises should work to not necessarily make the world a better place, but help with the long-term maintenance of the earth itself and the people within it. So the idea has two sides to it. So there's the side that businesses should try to minimize harm. And then there is the other side where it should also seek to maximize the benefits, again, of the earth and of the people on earth as well. ESG started years ago under another name, which you all are probably a little bit more familiar with, which is CSR, corporate social responsibility. So, corporate social responsibility often involved everything from philanthropy to community engagement to perhaps some efforts around diverse hiring and engagement with places like HBCUs or local high schools, etc. So, the idea behind corporate social responsibility was that if a business is doing business in a particular place, they have a responsibility to give back to that community. ESG takes it a step further because ESG says more than you are simply giving back as a philanthropic effort. The business itself should be engaged in the process of, again, minimizing harm to the communities it touches, as well as maximizing benefits to and within that community. This has a few different layers to it. And I think that some of the current events which have occurred, particularly around these global conferences, and I think some of the more recent events around the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well, has exposed some of the ways in which we have thought about ESG as being both superficial and a little immature. So if we thought of three layers to ESG, there is the idea of reconciliation, there is the idea of being fully present. And then there is the idea of being forward thinking and forward focused. So let's start with reconciliation. Reconciliation is the idea that you are willing to accept culpability for the role you may have played in causing harm, and then doing the work of being leveled in your power and influence to hear how you can improve the relationship with the parties whom you have harmed. So, a really salient example of reconciliation would be the post apartheid efforts in South Africa to bring the country together. So, of course, when you have these major conflicts, people don't just disappear into the ether, they are still there. And so you have to create some type of, again, culpability strategy while also creating a strategy for others who have been wronged to be heard. And so the idea around reconciliation in South Africa is to say, hey, we recognize that Native Africans and Black Africans, I'll put it like that, have been wronged by this system of apartheid. And as non-Black Africans, we have a responsibility to own up to the role that we've played in that harm, as well as hear how the effects of that harm have changed their lives for generations, and then go a step further to correct that harm. This is the part where a lot of businesses struggle. Because if you're honest with yourself, most of what you've done in your business has been around escaping culpability as a legal strategy. So if you think about most businesses and the way they handle everything from lawsuits to workers' compensation suits to employee relations complaints, it is around protecting the company's interests. And typically it's the financial interest or the brand. That is a direct enemy to much of what reconciliation seeks to accomplish. There has to be a level of admittance to harm. There has to be a level of accountability for the consequences of that harm. And I think that for a lot of companies, if you are going to really do ESG right, you have to develop the bravery and the courage to own up to the role that you've played. This shows up in a number of ways. So you have the more immediate impact of reconciliation. So, for example, Silicon Valley is a great example, actually, of thinking of how, okay, we've built these amazing companies, you're occupying this space in the Bay Area, but now that entire area has become completely unsustainable as far as cost of living. Companies who made their footing, who gained a lot of their wealth, who gained a lot of their prominence by moving in and encroaching in those spaces and driving up the cost of living, have to own up to the role that they've played there. And there has to be a certain level of reconciliation for that harm. And it is harm. If most of your people in an area cannot afford to live near where they work and where they contribute back to the area, that's harm. Okay. Another example of how this can show up in terms of reconciling at a larger level is admitting that most of the companies, especially that were founded in this country, largely profited off of the misuse and underpaid or unpaid labor of marginalized groups such as the Black and Indigenous communities and Latinx communities as well. It's also important to admit that in some cases, the very founding and history of your company could be based off of some nefarious stuff. So there are a number of companies that have recently, and by recently, I mean in the last 5 to 10 years, have been exposed for having participated in the transatlantic slave trade. So this idea that insurance companies profited off of insuring human traffickers, that uh, for example, merchants profited, banks profited, investment companies profited off of the sale and brutalization and torture of humans. Instead of trying to sweep that under the rug, there is a level of reconciliation that must happen. And there are some organizations who have at least tried to do it very well. There are a number of schools. I think I want to say, and I could be totally wrong about this, but I want to say Harvard is one that has recently tried to reach out to say, hey, we recognize that you are the descendants of people who were owned by the school. So we want to pay for your descendants to go to school for free. That is an example of reconciliation. It is understanding that we did something wrong. It had a negative impact on you and future versions of you in your bloodline or the people around you in your community. And so we want to course correct for that. Again, it takes a lot of bravery. It takes a lot of courage. And it is not just a one person show. So while the CEO or the head of the organization may be one of the front faces, it's going to take buy-in from a number of different people to make it work. The next part that I want to recognize with this is the idea of being fully present. As globalization gained its footing, one of the negative consequences, in my opinion, is that companies had a chance to hover almost like Big Brother without having to have sight and hearing to what actually is the outcome or impact of its work. So, for example, if your headquarters is based in a posh suburb of a major urban city and it's a beautiful campus, and when you come on the campus, it feels like you're just being immersed in the culture of this beautiful place. But most of your employees work in factories or work in buildings or conditions that far, far, far diminish the power of that particular feeling. That's an example of where you're not being fully present. And that is a lot of companies. So I'll give an example of a job that I worked There was the headquarters, which again was in this beautiful building. I think it was like LEED Platinum, so it had won all of these awards for the design, brand new building. But most of the workers worked out in literally what they call the field. And the irony of that is that most of the workers who worked out in the field were from Black and Brown communities, and most of the people who worked in the headquarters were not Black and not Brown. So there, right away, you start to see this chasm between groups. And so it was considered, oh, you one of those people. So when I would go out on site visits for my particular role, immediately they would dismiss me because it was, you don't understand, you one of them. There was a code that they used. It was the building number. I won't say it because I won't call this place out, but let's say it was 123. You one of those 123 folks, right? Because that was the building number for the address. And it was this idea that I could never empathize with them and I could never understand them, and they were pretty much just poo-pooing me until I went back to my little ivory tower. And that's so common for many companies. If you are a CEO or in a C-suite, you probably have no idea what it's like to work in your lowest paid positions work environment. I'm not even just talking about the work itself. I'm talking about the actual work environment. And so when we see TV shows like Undercover Boss, I think it was called, and so the supervisor has to go and flip burgers or bag orders or go and pack widgets into boxes. And they're like, oh my goodness, this is hard work. Like, what the heck? Right? Because we don't get to be fully present in that work. And if you lack that full presence in your company as well as in your community, there is no way that you can have a strong impact in ESG. Finally, you have to be forward focused. And so, as you start to reconcile for past wrongs, even if it was not you personally who did it, as you start to become fully present with both your workers and the community around you, you also want to think about what could the best possible outcome look like for these relationships. If you know that historically your presence has priced out the very workers who you want to attract, what would it look like for you to upend that? What would it look like for you to create a sustainable community where people can afford to own their homes, where people could afford to send their children to schools that were safe, where they could afford to receive adequate medical care? Would that mean that you have to offer subsidies for certain things? Would that mean that you have to actually move medical centers into position to make sure that people could have great care? What would it look like? Another aspect to this around being forward focused, and I'm going to spend more time talking about this when we get to governance, but the idea of lobbying. What would it look like to lobby ethically? And this is going to become even more of a concern because I think in the past, lobbying has been able to be a little hush hush. But if you pay any attention to social media, a lot of companies have gotten exposed over the last year or so. And well, let me say the last 5 years. And that exposure in many ways has been because the interests that the company espouses are not the interests that they actually invest in. So there's a shadow side to it. And then, as another part to that, with forward focused, it's about getting real about how your C suite shows up for what you say your ESG efforts are. And this is tricky because there are tons of studies which have shown that certain socioeconomic groups, certain age groups tend to lean in certain ways on the political spectrum, that there is this natural progression that almost happens. And so it's important for you to think about the ways in which your leaders' values and beliefs may betray what you espouse as the beliefs and values of the company. And this is not that you're trying to get people to conform to a certain way, but you do have to have that awareness because that can end up blowing up in your face in either direction with the political spectrum. It's not just relegated to one party. So again, those are just three aspects that I want us to start thinking about. ESG at its heart is action. Yes, it is intent. Yes, it is strategy. Yes, it is planning, and it's very important, but it is constant action. You should constantly be thinking about how you want to do better, be better, show up better, advocate better, represent better. And if you are not taking consistent action and progressive and scalable action, then you have to ask yourself, what are you really trying to accomplish? Because if you're only trying to go from crisis to crisis, that's not ESG. And that's definitely not sustainability. If you're trying to push it off until the next election or the next vote for boards, or when you retire as a C-suite leader and you're like, look, this could be somebody else's problem. I know the temptation to do that, but that's not sustainability either. It's not. And I think we've had a lot of that for a very, very long time. So I've said this before in other episodes, but I'm 37. And so I am a product of, I grew up at the, I would say in the thick of a lot of the outsourcing efforts. And I'm also, as y'all know by now, a native Detroiter. So I watched how the outsourcing of manufacturing jobs just decimated whole communities. And there was this idea that, look, we're trying to save money. This is better for the company overall. It'll be great for the economy because the stocks are going to go great. We're saving money. Shareholders are going to be great. They're going to be excited. But communities don't catch up that fast. Right. So if you think about the time that it takes to educate a workforce, to train a workforce, to prepare a workforce for that type of wide scale change, you need decades to do it. And so there was an assumption that the sustainability efforts of the company to be able to become more financially profitable, to have a larger footprint in the world economically, that has now backfired. And we see the communities, whole regions that have been decimated by loss of work, loss of industry. You can even see what's happening with the supply chain and all the issues that have occurred in the pandemic with everything from what is it, the microchips to food to clothing to car parts. All of these things have an impact on sustainability. So, one of the main things you should ask yourself, and this gets into the why, is how much of a short term loss am I willing to take to make a long term gain in sustainability? And this is where, as a leader, you have to check your ego because you want to win all the time. I totally get it. I'm a founder. I never want to have a losing streak. I never even want my business to be stagnant. Like if we just doing the same and holding steady, I get a little antsy. So I get the need to constantly be doing better, doing better. But there does come a point where you have to take a step back and say, you know what, in the short term, in that short run, we're probably going to lose a little bit, but the long run is going to set us up to win for a very long time. And especially when you're talking about prioritizing communities, I think what you'll find in your ESG efforts is that ends up putting you in a much more favorable light over the years anyway. And we can look at some companies that have prioritized short-term embarrassment for long-term sustainability and how they've actually played the game very well. And it is a bit of a game, right? So you just want to be thoughtful again about comparing those short-term and long-term impacts. And then finally, let's talk about the how. The how is simple. Everybody plays a role. If you relegate your sustainability efforts to your sustainability department or your CSR department, they will fail every time. They will fail every single time. When we get to the social episode, I'm going to talk to you about the ways in which workforce planning plays into that. And we'll think about the ways that workforce planning impacts sustainability for the company itself, but also for the communities. You have to be showing up in every area of your company. Marketing has to be bought into ESG. product development, research and development, engineering has to be bought in. What types of softwares or apps are you using? Do you operate in a cloud space? Where do you host? Where do you hold all your files? Is everything digitized? Are you sitting up somewhere with paper someplace? Where are you hosting meetings? Again, all of it, facilities has to be bought into it. Everything has to play a part. And so a part of your ESG strategy has to be targeted actions and targeted goals for every single functional area of your company. So what would it look like for everyone to be in operation with ESG and full throttle, foot on the gas acceleration? It's going to look different for every group. And particularly around finance, how much are you willing to invest? Because this stuff is not cheap, especially that reconciliation part. It might cost you some money to settle some lawsuits. It might cost you some money to pay out to course correct and fix some things in communities that you may have messed up. But if the long run is that people trust your brand and want to buy from you or want to come work for you, it's worth it. Because if you think about it, there are some companies that have completely burned out their reputation in whole towns. People do not want to work for this company and they can't even stay there to actually work. They have to go to other places. And unless you going to hire some Martians, you're going to need humans to do it. So that means you only going to have but so many communities that you can burn out before it's just like, okay, come on. Enough is enough. The last thing I want to bring up in talking about ESG, this is where I have to put on my sociologist hat. I wish I had a hat nearby. I would put it on. So much of ESG is about course correcting some of the pitfalls of how our economic and political and social systems have developed since the industrial era. There was such a huge push for technological advancement and efficiency and doing things faster. And how can we hack human systems to be able to get workers to produce more? This is where we have the invention of the factory as we know it, and assembly lines, and the legacy of the Ford era, right? Ford Motor Company and their system of doing work, and how it empowered us to be able to produce so much, and we're soaring even as a country economically. But then you start moving into modernity and post-modernity. And honestly, what we're seeing now, which I'm not even sure it has a name officially yet, but it's this idea that workers do not want to be treated simply as inputs and machines, that workers are people. And there is a level of mutual respect and benefit that's required. And I still don't think companies are aware of how to make that work. HR is not ready on how to help you do that either. HR desperately needs upskilling in this. Your finance team is not equipped for calculating the right formulas on how to do this. Your senior most leaders probably are not familiar with how to do it too, because they cut their chops in that same old system. So a key factor in ESG is understanding that from a sociological aspect, the world itself has changed in a way that it will never go backward. And how prepared are you to do the work of researching, of theorizing, of hypothesizing what that new world can look like in a way that doesn't feel threatening to you, but presents an opportunity? So we want to switch where it would show up in the quadrant of a SWOT analysis. What's your opportunity there? How can you leverage your strengths to get there instead of seeing it as a weakness or a threat? So we're going to spend this month spending some time talking through environmental, social, and governance individually. I'm so excited about this. Again, I know it's a really hot topic. It's got folks shaking in their boots. Everybody's scrambling, trying to figure it out. But I would encourage you to spend this month, as you watch the episodes, really reflecting before you hop into action. Just sit and think and process through stuff. Y'all know I'm big on reflecting and chewing on things until you get your aha moment. Until next time, I'm looking forward to seeing your comments. Tell me in the comments which part of ESG makes you most excited and which part makes you most afraid. Let me know in the comments. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And I normally don't say this part, but if you are interested in talking through what ESG efforts could look like in your company, please visit godreamforward.com and be sure to book a discovery call so that we can have a conversation. All right. Until next time, y'all. Bye.